organizations, obviously with oversee and supervision by the political authorities. But operationally, day-to-day wise, they tend to be more in charge.
Actually, what I was asking was whether his relationship with the Revolutionary Guard represents any kind of threat to the Iranian establishment, and whether he could give direct orders to the IRGC and have them act in a certain way in Iraq, Lebanon,
No, this is much more centralized, particularly on issues of critical concern, such as Iraq. It still goes to the Supreme Leader's office and so on. If the Supreme Leader's office asks him not to do something, he won't do it. But the problem is not so much who dominates who, as the New York Times story we're talking about, who's consolidating power against whom. The problem is meeting of minds. There's not consolidation of power, there's a consensus. I mean, the person who's against negotiating with the United States on the nuclear issue is the Supreme Leader. So it almost doesn't matter what the other subsidiary actors think or how they want to adjust the situation. So there's a greater degree of consensus than before.
Either of you want to address this? Right here, please.
Good morning. My name is Taghi Sagafi Nejad. I'm from Texas A&M International University on the border of Texas and Mexico. And I'm here to enjoy the conversation. I'm hearing a disturbing undercurrent in your presentation that assumes a certain amount of status quo with respect to the role of religion and religious tensions between Shiites and Sunnis, with regard to the stability of the political system in Iran, and with respect to the desirability of reform and democratic movement on the one hand, which is allegedly the intent of the US and the aim of the U.S. foreign policy, but on the other hand, we don't want to live with the consequences. My question is, how do you see this tension between religious elements, Shiite versus Sunni, playing out in the broader spectrum vis-a-vis, let's say, the secularist movement? There has been no mention of that in your conversation. And I got the feeling that you just assumed that these are really the two dominant forces that balance vis-a-vis one another. And related question of the role of women, which was mentioned several times, it is very disturbing to know that we advocate the policy of democratization, but when we see the manifestation of democratization in the sense of presenting the Shiite version of the role of women and the rule of inheritance and marriage and all of that, we tend to sort of accept that as a natural consequence and outcome of the democratization process, even though it runs contrary to the very fundamental ideas of Western democracy. How do you see all these contradictions playing out in the near future? And final indicative question of that is, how long do you think it's going to be before hijab becomes voluntary in Iran and throughout the Middle East?
Steve, you want to start?
Oh, thanks so much, and I appreciate that.
Well, maybe just broadly about secular versus religious politics to start with.
I think that prior to the Iraq War, this kind of question of Sunni-Shia tension was not as prominent as it was. I think there always was that kind of issue there, but directly, indirectly related to the invasion of Iraq, we have the way in which things have unfolded in Iraq, unfortunately, has created Sunni-Shia tension. Now, this question of secularists, there is a large reservoir of secularists, but as the kind of political tension has developed between Sunni and Shia, as was mentioned in the first panel this morning, people have sought to choose up sides. So even secular-oriented Shia, secular-oriented Sunnis, because they need to be protected in a place like Iraq, or they fear what might happen in Bahrain or the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, they tend to draw towards their own. And I think that that's an unfortunate scenario that is playing itself out throughout the region, and even in the broader Sunni world, there's this concern and this sort of choosing up sides against the Shia. I mean, after all, President Mubarak said in mid-May, said, well, after all, it's clear the Iraqi Shia are more loyal to Iran than they would be to Iraq or the Arab world, questioning the kind of Arabism of Arab Shia in Iraq. So I think that this is a creation, an unfortunate creation, an unintended consequence of the invasion and the inability to put together a political process, or in fact, a misapprehension, a misunderstanding of the undercurrents and the political dynamics and the sectarian undercurrents that were at play both in Iraq and in the region wide. Now, as far as democracy goes and women's rights, this just points to the complexity of trying to promote reform and change in the region. And you can, I mean, it's brought out in sharp relief by just what happens when people are elected and you don't like what they stand for. And this is a major philosophical problem that we're facing in the region, not just in the Shia world, but in Palestine, in Egypt, wherever. I'm not sure I have a very good answer what we should do about it, but it does open the United States up to these questions of inconsistency and double standards and hypocrisy. But
to some extent, the question is what democracy means. Does it simply mean that whoever the majority chooses is in power, or are there some broader philosophical underpinnings having to do with liberalism and human rights that really we're talking about, even though we call it democracy?
Well, I think that it depends on actually who you're talking to. But in the region, it's a particularly majoritarian view of democracy. For those of us who are interested in these issues and have looked at these, it is obviously broader than that. It's rule of law, development of institutions. But if the people in the region go to the polls and they say, well, this is democracy, and that's partly a problem of the Bush administration's lack of clear vision and strategy on this. Mm-hmm. Yes, they've talked about democracy and freedom, and they've been very effective about it, but it's stopped there.
Right.
Without the broader vision, you fall into these traps of problems of hypocrisy and double standards.
Toby, do you want to address any of it?
The second part of your question is, I mean, as I think Steve said it, as well as can be said. I mean, it's paradoxical and it's difficult and complicated, and at the end, for us, it's ultimately unsatisfying when these kinds of things happen. But, you know, I can connect that back up to the first question, and that is collaboration within the Shia community and between Shia and Sunni when it comes to secular groups, and where does religion and secularism and whatever else we want to call that exists, where does it come together? And in Saudi Arabia, because they don't have the demographic weight of Shia communities elsewhere, Shia leaders have displayed a tremendous amount of flexibility. The driving force politically in the Saudi Shia community, of course, is religious. But the people that get put forward to negotiate the Saudi political system are technocrats. They're business people who either have an experience in the West or have a series of business or other kinds of relationships with other Saudis. And can talk on a more sort of, you know, in a way that doesn't necessarily make religion the central part of what it is that they're trying to achieve. With that in mind, I mean, the Saudi Shia are always thinking that they're Shia. I mean, they always understand their relationship to everybody else. Also in Bahrain, there's been a degree of collaboration between al-Wafaq and the secular opposition, the old Baathists, the old communists, and other people who just consider themselves Democrats, where they work together, but the political reality is quite different. The secular opposition in Bahrain is beholden to al-Wafaq because they represent 65% of the population. And, you know, at the end of the day, they're willing to give up women's issues. When it comes to political reform, the Constitution, whatever their big goals are, they realize that this is complicated. But reform, I think, in spite of the kinds of problems that it would produce at the ballot box, also offers an opportunity in places like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain as well. And I don't know that it's a short-term fix, but it's more of a hopeful, you know, sort of vision for what could happen. And that is that the problem politically is that we don't have civil society in these places. But you have a lot of people that share a common ground, that don't have the opportunity to organize and deal with one another. The case was made to me in Saudi Arabia that liberals are more popular than they think they are, if you base this on a number of different things, by an Islamist. So clearly, you know, Sunni Islamists in Saudi Arabia see liberals as a threat. Now, they take the threat seriously. So should we assume that seculars or liberals or liberal Islamists don't exist because they don't have a voice in Saudi Arabia? Or do they exist and they need an opportunity to sort of pursue their interests? And I think it's the latter. So I don't know that women's issues would necessarily work themselves out in this ideal world, but perhaps it's the best we can hope for at this point.
And I just want to follow up on what you asked, because the question is whether there really is any kind of secular politics in the region. And I mean, even if, when I was in Saudi Arabia last in December, and women were seeking to promote their interests and their rights, they did it through discussion of what the Prophet's daughter did and so on. In other words, the idea was you have to fight on that ground. And even in the first panel, when the discussion was begun that, in fact, Shiism was originally a political movement in the sense that it had to do with who would succeed the Prophet, I mean, I find it hard to distinguish between a political and a religious discussion there, because it's about who will succeed the Prophet. I don't know if there are any secular politics in the region.
I think it's sorry, Toby, but I think it's quite shrewd for women who are trying to advance their interests.
I'm with you.
To speak in a kind of vernacular politics, politics that people are going to understand, and it certainly has squeezed out secular politics. So I would say, at the risk of being too extreme about it, I'd say there's very little secular politics.
Very little, yeah. Ray, do you think that there's more than I think?
As I said before, the interesting to me is even secular individuals seek political empowerment by being associated with religious parties.
Right.
Because those religious parties are now emerged as popular parties and capable of organization and all the things that politics brings about. They're just better organized political parties. And therefore, if you're a secular Shiite, you tend to see dawah or what have you as representative of your communal interests, and therefore you're willing to live with some of the restrictions. As far as when is hijab going to be disbanded, well, there's good news, bad news. The good news is the social restrictions are unlikely to become more onerous. The bad news is the social restrictions are in place, remain intact. So.
Other questions? Sure. Just take that mic if you would.
My name is Nader Talebzadeh. I'm from Iran. I'm a private company doing documentary. My first question is, I think it's escaped everyone's radar to realize that no Iranian press, no formal government Iranian press, is allowed into the United States because of the U.S. policy. And why this is so, because after 26, 27 years, one of the main impediments, one of the main barriers for dialogue has been the absence of Iranian press, which is, in terms of television, all government. We've had a complete ban. I've come here as a private company, and especially at such a critical time, the present crisis, which we have no news from Iran, no news people from Iran to be present in the States, and have the opportunity to talk to the American political elite, as of course we have the opposite is very true. In Iran we have over 100 American news-related people every year. This, I think, I would like to ask the American intelligentsia, the academia, why haven't they pressured the U.S. government for the serious presence of Iranian press within the United States, especially television, which I think has enhanced the present danger, continuing danger. That's my first question, why? My second question is, how much effect does the American intelligentsia, the elite of the academia, have on the present crisis? How much can they prevent this avalanche of catastrophe that might come forward? How much effect would they have in this present crisis? Or do they have any effect? Is it a feeble presence?
Okay.
Or can it potentially be effective?
Thank you very much. Okay, so how important are you guys?
I was under the impression that IRNA had some sort of Iranian Islamic news agency had a correspondent in New York.
Only in the UN.
In the UN. Okay.
With a C, with a crew visa. I mean, just like an airplane visa.
Right.
Okay.
Not media visa. We came as media as a type.
Right.
No Iranian television crew or correspondent can officially come to the United States. This has been a continuing policy for the past 26 years.
Okay. I think that's a fair point. I mean, you were
that's a very
press
interesting
access.
question.
As far as relevance, I always, when I write something, I assume no readership. And I'm quite often right about that.
It's good to be right. But I mean, on the question of Iranian media presence in the United States, I don't know a lot about it. It sounds like you're right.